Hey everyone, welcome back to more malicious compliance stories from Reddit. Picture this. Your boss lets you go because of a disability and then tosses you a single month's salary to make you disappear quietly. Karen assumed I was helpless sitting in a wheelchair, but she had clearly never bothered reading my contract or studying the law. I held complete control over her entire business, and she didn't figure that out until everything had already fallen apart. Let's get right into it. Our first story is a satisfying XXL malicious compliance tale titled, Karen Manager Fired Me for Being in a Wheelchair. So I'm originally from the UK, but I've been living in Gibraltar for several years now. If you're not too familiar with Gibraltar, it's this tiny British overseas territory perched right at the southern tip of Spain. We're talking about just 2.6 square miles of land, with roughly 30,000 people packed inside. Everybody knows everybody, and gossip spreads faster than Wi-Fi. That last detail becomes extremely relevant a bit later on. So I was working at a bar in one of the busier tourist areas. I'm keeping the precise location deliberately vague for obvious reasons, but anyone familiar with Gibraltar will know exactly the type of spot I'm describing. It wasn't some upscale cocktail bar, just a proper pub-style place drawing in a blend of locals, British military guys from the base, and tourists stepping off the cruise ships that pulled in nearly every other day. The kind of establishment where you're pulling pints and mixing gin and tonics all day long. Nothing overly complicated about it. The owner, who I'll be referring to as Karen because she absolutely earned that label time and time again, had purchased the business several years before I came on board. She'd inherited some money and decided she wanted to be her own boss. So she bought the bar from the previous owner who was heading into retirement. She leased the physical premises from the landlord, but the business operation itself was entirely hers. She ran it and managed it every single day, which essentially meant there was nobody above her to point out when she was going completely off the rails. Lucky us, right? I was among the very first employees she brought on after taking over, and by that point, I'd been bartending around Gibraltar for years. I knew the regulars, I knew the suppliers, and I knew the licensing regulations inside and out. So I was a strong hire, and she was well aware of it. Now, here's something worth understanding about running a bar in Gibraltar. The licensing laws are genuinely strict, far stricter than most people would ever anticipate. You need a proper liquor license issued by the licensing authority, and it's not the kind of thing you just sign once and stick in a drawer. There's an entire process involving formal applications, background checks, inspections, and conditions that must continuously be met. And crucially, the license is tied to one specific named individual, the licensee, who carries personal legal responsibility for the premises. That person must be qualified, must have real experience in the hospitality industry, and must be actively involved in the day-to-day running of the establishment. When Karen took over, she had a problem. She didn't have the experience or qualifications to serve as the licensee herself. She hadn't worked a single day in hospitality her entire life. Prior to purchasing the bar, she had been doing admin work for some company across the border in Spain. She'd watched a handful of episodes of those bar makeover programs on television and read some blog posts about generating passive income through hospitality, and she concluded that running a pub seemed like easy money. The previous owner's license obviously lapsed when he departed since it was attached to him personally, and he was retiring and leaving Gibraltar entirely. That's where I came into the picture. I had years of relevant experience and held all the certifications required in Gibraltar for responsible alcohol service. I understood the regulations thoroughly and had a clean record. Karen needed someone to be the named licensee for the premises, and I was essentially the only suitable candidate she had available. We worked out an arrangement. I would be the license holder, meaning that legally I was the individual responsible for ensuring the bar operated within the law, that alcohol was dispensed responsibly, and that the premises satisfied all the conditions of the license. All of that, on top of my standard wages for working behind the bar, earned me a modest monthly payment for holding the license. Think of it as something like a retainer. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was decent enough to make the arrangement well worth it given the legal responsibility I was taking on. I mentioned to her on several occasions over the years that she really ought to look into getting her own qualifications sorted so she could eventually hold the license under her own name. It made obvious sense since it was her business. But every time I raised it, she brushed it off with something along the lines of, I don't have to sit through some boring course. That's what I pay you for. So that never went anywhere. We put everything down in writing, though. A proper agreement drafted with a lawyer, because I'm absolutely not naive, and I'd heard more than enough stories about business owners trying to take advantage of employees to know that documentation was essential. The agreement was explicit. The license was in my name. I was the named licensee, and the monthly retainer was guaranteed for as long as I held it. And if my employment concluded for any reason whatsoever, we would be required to arrange a proper transfer of the license to another qualified individual through the correct legal process. Until that transfer was completed through the proper channels, the bar could not legally sell alcohol under my license without my active involvement. Straightforward as that. And by the way, as seasoned veterans of malicious compliance stories, you can probably already see where this is heading. Let me know in the comments what type of Reddit story you enjoy most. Right now, I personally love these malicious compliance tales, but I'm genuinely curious about your preferences. Also, let me know where you're watching from today, and don't forget to hit like if you're enjoying these XXL stories. For roughly 2 years, things were actually tolerable. Not great, but manageable. Karen was always Karen. One of those managers who had never pulled a single bar shift in her life, yet would position herself behind you during a Friday evening rush to inform you that you were pouring pints incorrectly. She would hover around the bar during peak hours, getting in everybody's way, rearranging bottles on the shelves while there was a queue 10 people deep, then vanish to handle admin during the quiet afternoon stretches when we actually needed an extra pair of hands for restocking. She also got into disputes with customers on a regular basis. On one occasion, she informed a group of Spanish tourists that they needed to speak English because this was British territory, which, if you know anything about Gibraltar and the complicated cross-border dynamic with Spain, landed about as well as you'd expect. The group left immediately, and she turned to me and said, "See, this is the problem with not having proper border control." I had to pretend I was searching for something beneath the bar so she wouldn't catch the expression on my face. Another time, she refused to honor a happy hour price for a local regular because he had apparently been rude to her the previous week. The man hadn't been rude at all. He had simply asked whether the toilets could be cleaned more regularly, which, to be honest, they genuinely could have been, but she held grudges as though it were competitive discipline. She had this particular way of speaking to staff as if we were children caught stealing biscuits. Everything was my bar and my business, and I built this from nothing. I once heard her tell a new hire during their training, verbatim, "Without me, none of you would have a job." So I think a little gratitude instead of attitude would go a really long way. That new hire lasted 3 weeks. Hard to imagine why. She also had a habit of rearranging the schedule at the last minute and then acting as if you were being completely unreasonable for having prior commitments. One time she messaged me at 11 p.m. asking me to open at 7 a.m. the following morning because she had forgotten to put anyone on the rota. When I explained I couldn't make it because I had a medical appointment, she responded, "Well, I guess I'll just have to do everything myself as usual." Some of us actually care about this business. She then didn't turn up to open either, and the bar ended up opening 2 hours late. When I brought it up with her the next day, she said she'd been dealing with a personal emergency, which, based on the tan she returned with, I'm guessing was an emergency outing to the beach, but whatever. I needed the job, the extra license money was useful, and I mostly kept my head down and got through it. The rest of the staff felt the same way. We'd all exchange eye rolls behind her back, debrief each other during smoke breaks, and power through the shifts. It wasn't the worst job I'd ever had, but Karen made sure it was never close to the best either. Then, roughly 2 years in, my entire world changed. I had an accident. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's honestly still something I'm processing, but essentially I was struck by a car while crossing the road near the border. It was serious, genuinely serious, and I spent weeks in hospital, underwent multiple surgeries, and when I was finally discharged, I was in a wheelchair. The doctors told me there was a realistic possibility I could walk again, eventually with intensive physiotherapy and sufficient time. But for the foreseeable future, the wheelchair was my new reality. I won't pretend I handled it like a champion from the very beginning. There were dark days, Weeks where I had no desire to see or speak to anyone. The adjustment was brutal, and I'm honestly still working through a great deal of it. But I'm a stubborn person by nature. And gradually, with the support of my physiotherapy team and some good friends, I started coming through the other side. I got used to moving through the world in a chair, built up my strength, and after several months of recovery, I started thinking seriously about returning to some version of normal life, including going back to work. The bar had a ground floor layout with no stairs to contend with it all. The bar counter had a lower section where we used to handle table service prep and paperwork. The cellar was downstairs, but changing kegs was only one component of the job, and other staff could manage that without any difficulty. I could still take orders, operate the tills, serve drinks from the lower section, manage stock ordering, handle the accounts, liaise with suppliers by phone, oversee licensing compliance. There was genuinely plenty I was capable of contributing, and I've been thinking carefully about exactly how to make it work. I even looked into what reasonable adjustments might be required, and it amounted to fairly minor changes. I reached out to Karen and told her I was eager to return, even if it meant starting part-time while I continued my physiotherapy. I was genuinely nervous about the conversation because I hadn't heard much from her since the accident. She had sent one text roughly a week after it happened that read, "Heard about your accident. Hope you're okay. Take care of yourself." And that was the entirety of it. No visit, no follow-up call, nothing further. One of the other staff members told me that Karen had said in front of everyone that my accident was really inconvenient timing because they were about to hit tourist season. That give you a fairly clear picture of the level of empathy we were dealing with. She was not reasonable about it. Not remotely. I'll never forget that phone call. I explained that I was prepared to return to work, that I'd been making excellent progress with physio, that I was managing well in the chair, and that I was confident I could handle the majority of my duties with some relatively minor adjustments. There was a long pause, the kind of pause where you can almost sense someone carefully selecting their words. And then she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "I'm sorry, but I just don't see how this is going to work. A wheelchair behind my bar. What are the customers going to think? It's not exactly the image I'm going for." I was stunned for a few seconds. I genuinely thought she was joking. I actually waited for the punchline. When none came, I said something like, "What image, Karen? It's a pub, not a bloody fashion runway." But she didn't laugh, not even slightly. Instead, she told me she had moved on and hired people to cover my shifts, and that she thought it would be simpler for everyone if we just parted ways. She actually said, with what I could have sworn was genuine sincerity in her voice, that she was doing me a favor because the job would be too stressful and too demanding for me now, and that she didn't want me to struggle or injure myself. As though she were being compassionate. As though she were the hero of this particular story. I tried to stay calm. I tried to explain that disability discrimination is literally illegal under the Equal Opportunities Act in Gibraltar, and that employers are legally required to make reasonable adjustments, and that she simply could not dismiss me because I was in a wheelchair. She became defensive immediately, insisting she wasn't dismissing me because of the wheelchair, but rather because operational needs had evolved and she had undergone a business restructuring. I asked her to specify exactly what restructuring had taken place, and she stumbled over her words and couldn't provide a single concrete answer. She just kept repeating corporate-sounding buzzwords she had clearly spent 10 minutes looking up before the call. And then she said the thing that still makes my blood boil to this day. "Look, I'm trying to be nice about this. You're in a wheelchair now. The job is physical and you cannot do it. I don't understand why you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. I will give you a month's pay and we'll call it even. That's more than fair. A month's pay. One single month for 2 years of work. For being one of our most dependable employees. And best of all, for holding the liquor license that our entire business legally depended upon to operate." I took a deep breath, probably the deepest breath of my life. And I asked her very calmly, "So just to be completely clear, you are terminating my employment. Is that correct?" And she said yes. I said, "And you understand what that means for the license situation?" Silence. "Then what do you mean?" I said, "Karen, the liquor license is in my name. I'm the licensee. If I'm no longer employed at the premises, you're going to need to arrange a transfer to someone else who is qualified. You cannot simply continue operating under my license when I'm no longer working there." Another silence, longer this time. Then she laughed and said, "Oh, don't be so dramatic. That's just a bit of admin work. I'll sort it out myself. I'll put in my name or get one of the other staff to do it. It's not a big deal." I wanted to say about 15 different things at that moment. I wanted to tell her she had no idea what she was talking about. I wanted to explain that she couldn't hold the license because she had zero qualifications and her track record of running the place was frankly disastrous. I wanted to remind her of all those times I'd suggested she get qualified and she couldn't be bothered. But I didn't say any of it. I just said, "All right then." And she said, "Good. I'll have someone box up your things and you can come collect them whenever. Just take your stuff and go. Let's not make this into a big drama. Take your stuff and go, right?" "Okay, Karen." Because here's the reality about getting a liquor license transferred or a new one issued in Gibraltar. It is absolutely, categorically not just a bit of admin work. It's a formal legal process overseen by the licensing authority. You have to submit a complete application, demonstrate that the proposed new licensee is a fit and proper person, prove that they possess the necessary qualifications and experience, potentially have the premises re-inspected, and the entire thing must receive official approval. It can take months, even when everything proceeds smoothly and the applicant is ideal. And Karen, who had zero hospitality qualifications, zero licensing experience, who I'd been advising for 2 years to get her own credentials in order, and who had already been cited for noise complaints from the residential properties above the bar on 2 separate occasions, was not going to find this process swift or straightforward. After I hung up, I sat in my flat for probably an hour, just staring at the wall and processing everything. The anger came in waves. This woman had looked at me, seen the wheelchair, and concluded that I was worthless. After 2 years of keeping her business legally operational, after every bank holiday weekend I worked because she wanted the day off, after every time I handled licensing inspections solo while she hid in the back office because she didn't understand the regulations, after every time I smoothed things over with customers she had managed to offend, I was done being accommodating. But I also remembered exactly what she had said to me. She said, "Take your stuff and go." Fine. The license was my stuff, and legally it was literally mine. She told me to take my stuff and go. So that's precisely what I intended to do. I called my lawyer first thing the following morning, walked him through everything that had occurred and every word she had said. My lawyer told me that between my notes and the text she had sent, we had an exceptionally strong disability discrimination case under the Equal Opportunities Act. He also flagged the obvious. She had a massive licensing problem headed straight for her. He advised me to handle everything strictly by the book. So I wrote Karen a formal letter. Very professional, very composed, no emotion whatsoever. I stated that following my termination, I was providing formal notice that I would be withdrawing as the license holder for the premises, effective in 30 days. I outlined that this was in accordance with our original agreement and the relevant licensing regulations. I also noted that I would be seeking legal counsel regarding the circumstances of my dismissal. Every word in that letter was factually accurate, legally sound, and enormously inconvenient for Karen. Then I waited. It took her nearly a week to respond, and when she did, professionalism was nowhere on the menu. She called me absolutely screaming. I could barely decipher what she was saying at first because she was so hysterical. The general substance of it was that I was, according to her, attempting to destroy her business, that I was being vindictive and petty because I was upset about the wheelchair, that she had given me an opportunity when nobody else would have, and that she was going to sue me for everything I owned. My personal favorite moment was when she called me an ungrateful. Yes, she actually said that out loud. And no, she didn't appear to grasp how catastrophically that would land in any future legal proceedings. I let her carry on for roughly 2 minutes, then told her very calmly that all further communication should be directed to my lawyer, and hung up. My hands were trembling after that call, not from fear, but from anger, and also from the very particular satisfaction of knowing she had just made her legal situation approximately 10 times worse with every word she'd uttered. Over the following couple of weeks, she attempted every approach she could think of. She sent texts alternating between threats and desperate pleas to reconsider, sometimes within the same hour. One message would read, "My lawyer says you cannot do this, and you'll be hearing from him." And then literally 20 minutes later, "Can we please just meet and talk about this like adults? I'm sure we can work something out. I'll even offer you more money." Then an hour later, "You're going to regret this. I know people." I screenshotted every single one, forwarded them all to my lawyer, and didn't respond to a single message. She even dispatched one of the other bartenders to my flat to try to speak with me. The poor lad showed up at my door, looking like he would have preferred to be absolutely anywhere else on the planet. He essentially explained that Karen had sent him to open a dialogue about a resolution, which I'm fairly certain were her exact words she'd instructed him to memorize. I told him I had nothing against him personally, but this matter was between me and Karen, and everything needed to flow through the lawyers at this stage. He apologized, looked genuinely relieved the conversation was over, and left. I felt for the guy. I heard later through another former colleague that Karen had been telling all the staff I was holding the bar hostage out of spite because I was supposedly bitter about being in a wheelchair and wanted to drag everyone else down with me. Absolutely classic Karen. Never her fault, always the victim. My 30-day notice period expired, and I formally notified the licensing authority in writing that I was withdrawing as license holder for the premises, including all relevant documentation. Copies of my original agreement with Karen, proof of my employment termination, and everything else required. I was meticulous about following every step exactly by the book. No drama, no angry correspondence, no spite, just a proper legal process executed to the letter. She told me to take my stuff and go. So I did exactly that. I took my stuff and went. What followed was as foreseeable as sunrise to anyone who understood how licensing functions in Gibraltar, but apparently arrived as a complete thunderbolt to Karen. The licensing authority contacted her and informed her that the premises no longer held a valid license and that she was required to immediately cease the sale of alcohol until a new licensing arrangement was established. She could keep the bar open for food and soft drinks, but not a single drop of alcohol could be served or sold. Just take a moment to picture that. A pub sitting in the middle of a tourist area in Gibraltar, right in the path of cruise ship passengers wandering past in search of a cold drink. Unable to serve a single beer, unable to pour a single glass of wine, unable to mix a gin and tonic on a warm afternoon. In Gibraltar, where sunshine is essentially constant and tourists are perpetually after cold drinks. From what I gathered through people I knew, and as I mentioned earlier, in Gibraltar you hear everything because the whole territory operates like one enormous village. Karen absolutely, completely, and utterly lost the plot. She apparently told the licensing officials she would have it sorted within days, and then simply continued serving alcohol anyway. She genuinely seemed to believe the rules were more like loose suggestions, and that if she just carried on as normal, no one would notice or no one would care enough to actually enforce anything. She reportedly instructed her staff that it was just a technicality and to keep pouring drinks as usual. Yeah, that went exactly as well as you're imagining. Here's the thing about licensing enforcement in Gibraltar. It's a compact jurisdiction and the authorities take these matters seriously because the entire territory's economy depends heavily on tourism and on businesses operating properly and legally. Once they had been formally notified that there was no valid licensee for the premises any longer, Karen's Bar was squarely on their radar. An inspection took place within a couple of weeks. Officers walked in and found the place running at full capacity. Taps flowing, spirits being poured, cocktails being mixed. All of it without a valid license. And this is where things escalated from bad to genuinely catastrophic for Karen. Selling alcohol without a license in Gibraltar is not a minor administrative slip. It's not a fine and a stern talking to. It is a criminal offense under the Licensing and Fees Act, and the bar was ordered to shut down immediately. During the inspection, they also uncovered several additional issues I won't elaborate on too much, but let's just say Karen's approach to health and safety regulations and food hygiene standards was about as thorough as her approach to employment law. There were violations stacked upon violations. Meanwhile, my disability discrimination case was progressing through the system. My lawyer had been confident from the outset, and with the evidence we had assembled, It would genuinely have been difficult to lose. Karen had practically gift wrapped the entire case with that initial phone call in which she spoke about wheelchairs not fitting the image of her bar. And then there was the text she had sent me following our conversation, which read, and I know this verbatim because I've read it approximately 100 times. I really am sorry about what happened to you, but you have to understand a bar is a physical job, and I need staff who can actually move around properly. My lawyer could barely contain himself when I showed him that one. She had essentially written our closing argument for us. I won't detail every step of the legal proceedings because most of it was procedural and, honestly, fairly tedious. Lots of correspondence going back and forth, lots of waiting. But the outcome was that I received a substantial settlement for unfair dismissal and disability discrimination. Karen's legal team attempted to argue that the dismissal had been for genuine operational reasons. But when asked to produce evidence of the supposed restructuring, they had absolutely nothing. No restructuring plan, no written justification, no evidence that my specific role had been altered or eliminated in any way, because none of that had ever existed. She simply did not want a man in a wheelchair working in her bar. It was that straightforward and that ugly. As for the bar itself, last I heard, it's finished. Done. Karen attempted to apply for a new liquor license in her own name, but her application was denied. As it turns out, the licensing authority isn't particularly enthusiastic about granting licenses to individuals who have just been caught selling alcohol illegally after being explicitly told to stop. She then tried to have one of her remaining staff members apply as the new licensee. But by that point, most of them had already walked out because nobody wants to work for someone who has clearly demonstrated she'll break the law without hesitation and sacrifice her employees when things go wrong. For what I was told, she ultimately pleaded guilty to the charge of selling without a license and received a substantial fine, though I don't know the precise figure. I heard she eventually tried to sell the business, but found no interested buyers because everyone in Gibraltar knew the full story. In a place that size, that kind of reputation follows you absolutely everywhere. The landlord ultimately terminated her lease because she couldn't keep up with rent payments on a bar that was incapable of selling its primary product. The space sat vacant for a few months, and I believe someone else has since taken it over and is running it properly with their own license, all properly arranged. And yeah, guys, please don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying these malicious compliance stories. And now we'll move on to another fantastic one. The next story is titled, "Want Your Dogs to Be Off Leash in the Park? It would be a shame if they escaped." So this one is unique because the malicious compliance was actually directed at me and my neighbors by the city. I can't stop thinking about how brilliantly clever their response was, so I had to share it here. Some background. I live adjacent to a 4-quadrant park with cross streets running through it. So each quadrant is 1 block by 1 block in size. One of those quadrants is fenced in and may or may not be owned by the local school district. There were some murky dealings involved, and it's not entirely clear whether they ever legally owned that quadrant. I won't get into the specifics, but the neighborhood has been fighting for access to this park for as long as anyone can remember. Recently, that quadrant was completely renovated using public funds, and since it serves as an outdoor area for the children during school hours, it has reasonably solid security. The only entry and exit points are 4 doors at each corner of the quadrant. The arrangement negotiated with the community was that during non-school hours, meaning Monday through Friday after 3 p.m. and all day Saturday and Sunday, the quadrant would be open to the public and those doors would remain unlocked. Well, shortly after the park opened, people, myself included, and this is not an am I the a-hole post, by the way. I'm fully aware I shouldn't have done this. This is a self-deprecating story. Began letting their dogs run freely in this park. It was perfect since it was completely enclosed. When complaints started reaching the city, my wife and I stopped letting our dog in there, but others carried on doing it. The city simply couldn't lock the whole thing up and deny the entire community their access. But how do you prevent dogs from being off-leash? Well, in my opinion, they came up with the most elegantly simple yet ingenious solution imaginable. Rather than locking all the doors to the park, they propped them permanently open during non-school hours. Now, if you wander in to let your dog run free, There are 4 wide-open escape routes leading directly into a relatively high-traffic area that your dog could bolt through at any moment. I still spot a few exceptionally well-trained dogs running around in there from time to time, but the vast majority of people simply aren't willing to take that risk anymore. And yeah, guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these malicious compliance stories, and I'll see you again soon.